The evening of July 23, 2008, in Bridger, Teton National Forest in the state of Wyoming was warm and cloudless. Hannah Kendrick, a 17-year-old high school graduate from Denver, was sitting by a campfire with her 21-year-old older sister, Lillian, a student at the University of Colorado. They were roasting marshmallows on long sticks, laughing, and talking about Hannah's plans to start college that coming fall. Around them, at the Granite Creek campground, stood about 20 other tents belonging to tourists, families with children, older couples, groups of teenagers. It was a typical summer evening in one of the most beautiful places in America. The sisters had arrived the day before, on July 22nd, in a rented Jeep Cherokee and planned to spend 4 days in nature. It was a tradition started by their father, Marcus Kendrick, who had taken his daughters camping every summer until his death from cancer 3 years earlier. Now Lillian and Hannah continued the tradition together, as a way to honor their father's memory and maintain their bond, even though Lillian was already living on her own in a college dorm. Their mother, Deborah Kendrick, had been worried about letting her daughters go into the wilderness alone. At least take pepper spray for bears, she had insisted. Lillian listened and bought 2 canisters at an outdoor store, even though she secretly felt her mother was exaggerating the danger. "Mom, there will be lots of people there. Rangers patrol the area. Everything will be fine," she reassured Deborah over the phone before leaving. At around 9 p.m. on July 23rd, nearby campers, a middle-aged couple named Tom and Linda Hoffman from Utah, whose campsite was about 100 feet from the sisters, noticed the girls putting out their campfire and heading into their blue 2-person tent. "Good night," Lillian called out to the Hoffmans. "Good night," Tom replied. Those were the last words anyone ever heard from the Kendrick sisters. On the morning of July 24th, Linda Hoffman woke up around 7 a.m. and immediately noticed something strange. The sisters' tent was still standing, but the zipper at the entrance was completely open and part of the side wall appeared to be slashed. Several items were scattered near the entrance: a sleeping bag, some clothing, a flashlight. The Jeep Cherokee was still parked where it had been, but the girls themselves were nowhere to be seen. At first, Linda assumed the sisters had simply gone to the nearby creek to wash up or to the restroom about 300 feet away. But when the girls still hadn't returned by 8 a.m., Tom Hoffman decided to take a closer look at their tent. What he saw made him call the Rangers immediately. The tent had been cut open from the inside. A long vertical slash ran down the side wall, made with something sharp, possibly a knife. The sisters' belongings were strewn about chaotically, as if someone had hurriedly searched through them. Their backpacks lay partially emptied beside the tent. The sisters' phones, wallets, and car keys were all still there. But Hannah and Lillian were gone. Ranger James Coleman arrived about 20 minutes later. He immediately classified the situation as an emergency. The slashed tent, the abandoned personal items, the missing girls, it all pointed to something being seriously wrong. He called for backup and began questioning other campers at the site. No one had heard anything during the night. No screams, no sounds of a struggle, no suspicious noises. The forest had been quiet, just the usual nighttime sounds: owls, wind in the trees, distant coyotes howling. By midday, deputies from the Teton County Sheriff's Office arrived at the campground and launched a large-scale search operation. Tracking dogs picked up the sisters' scent at the tent and led search teams into the forest southwest of the campground. The trail continued for about a mile, then suddenly stopped near an old dirt road. The dogs circled, whined, and were unable to pick up the scent again. This suggested the girls may have been placed into a vehicle. At around 2 p.m., Deborah Kendrick received a phone call from the sheriff. When she heard that her daughters were missing, she collapsed and lost consciousness. Her younger brother, David, who was nearby, took the phone and learned the details. An hour later, he was driving Deborah from Denver to Wyoming, a distance of nearly 250 miles, which he covered in about 5 hours, ignoring every speed limit along the way. The search continued around the clock. By the evening of July 24th, more than 80 people were involved: park rangers, police officers, volunteers from nearby towns, and members of search and rescue organizations. A helicopter swept over the forest. 9 units combed the area. Divers searched the surrounding bodies of water. They found nothing. On the second day of the search, July 25th, investigators began reviewing the list of registered visitors to the forest. About 300 names were logged in the visitor book from the previous week. Every single person was tracked down, interviewed, and checked. All registered sex offenders in the surrounding area were also investigated, 12 in total. Every one of them had an alibi or was far from the forest on the day the sisters disappeared. The media quickly picked up the story. Two young sisters vanishing under mysterious circumstances in a national forest captured national attention. CNN, NBC, and local TV stations all reported on the search. Photos of Hannah and Lillian were broadcast across the country. The tip hotline received hundreds of calls, but most turned out to be false leads or baseless conspiracy theories. By the end of the first week, on July 30th, the search was officially scaled back. The massive operation involving hundreds of people was replaced by routine patrols carried out by a smaller group of rangers and deputies. Teton County Sheriff Robert Mills held a press conference, admitting that no physical evidence had been found and that the case was now being treated as a possible abduction, without witnesses, without evidence, without leads. Deborah Kendrick refused to leave Wyoming. She rented a room at a motel in Jackson, about 20 miles from the campground, and returned every day to the spot where her daughters had last been seen. She stood there for hours, crying and praying. She plastered the town with posters showing Hannah's and Lillian's faces and offered a cash reward for any information. Days passed. A week. 2 weeks. Hope began to fade. Statistics were merciless. The more time passed after a disappearance, the lower the chances of finding someone alive. Investigators quietly began preparing for the worst, a recovery operation, not a rescue. But no one knew that just 3 miles from the campground, deep underground in a cold, damp karst cave, Hannah and Lillian Kendrick were still alive. Barely alive, exhausted, traumatized, but alive. And they were clinging to the last fragile hope that someone would find them. On the morning of August 14th, 2008, the 22nd day since the sisters vanished, a group of cave researchers from the University of Montana was exploring a karst cave system in the western part of the national forest. It was a routine scientific expedition, studying geological formations, mapping unexplored passages, collecting mineral samples. The team consisted of 4 experienced speleologists, Professor Daniel Morris, 52, the expedition leader, and 3 of his students, Kyle Chung, Sarah Wentworth, and Miguel Rodriguez. At around 11 a.m., they were examining a narrow passage in a cave listed on their map as Granite Creek, Cave Number 7. The cave was known to local cavers and considered small and unremarkable, only a few chambers, a maximum depth of about 50 feet. Still, Morris wanted to test a theory that additional passages might have been overlooked by earlier explorers. They descended into the main chamber when Sarah Wentworth suddenly stopped. "Do you hear that?" she asked, switching off her headlamp. The others fell silent and listened. At first, there was nothing, just dripping water and the echo of their own breathing. Then, a faint sound, barely audible, a knocking, a rhythmic knocking coming from somewhere deep within the cave. "Probably rocks falling," Kyle suggested. Sarah shook her head. "No, it's too regular. It sounds intentional." Professor Morris frowned. "Let's check it out." They continued deeper, moving toward the sound. The knocking grew louder. Now they could all hear it clearly, a metallic sound. 3 short knocks. A pause. 3 short knocks again. An SOS signal. "Oh my God," Sarah whispered. "Someone's down there." They quickened their pace and followed the narrow passage into a side chamber. The chamber was small, about 13 by 16 feet, with a low ceiling. And there, in the far corner, illuminated by their headlamps, they saw them. 2 women, or rather, 2 skeletal figures that looked more like ghosts than living human beings. They were sitting on the stone floor with their backs against the wall. Their wrists were bound with a bicycle cable attached to a thick iron pipe driven into the cave floor. One of the women was unconscious, her head slumped forward against her chest. The other stared at them with wide, frantic eyes. Her lips moved as if she were trying to say something. Professor Morris was the first to snap out of the shock. "Kyle, get help. Now," he shouted, rushing toward the women. Sarah and Miguel followed. They dropped to their knees beside the sisters and could hardly believe what they were seeing. The women were in horrific condition. Their clothes, t-shirts and shorts, were filthy, torn, almost reduced to rags. Their skin was gray, stretched tight over bone. Their hair was matted and caked with dirt. Across their bodies, arms, and faces were bruises, abrasions, and strange round marks that looked like cigarette burns. The smell was overwhelming, a mix of sweat, urine, and decay. The woman who was conscious tried to speak. Her voice was hoarse, barely audible. "Help!" Sarah took her hand, fighting back tears. "We're here. You're safe now. We're going to help you. What's your name?" The woman swallowed. Every word seemed to cost her enormous effort. Lillian, sister, Hannah. She weakly nodded toward the second woman, who was still unconscious. Professor Morris froze. Lillian, Hannah, are you the Kendrick sisters? He remembered the news. Everyone did. Two sisters who had vanished 3 weeks earlier, presumed dead by most investigators. Lillian nodded faintly. A tear rolled down her dirt-streaked cheek. Cal was already shouting into his radio, calling the surface and emergency services. We need medical assistance immediately. We found the Kendrick sisters. They're alive. I repeat, they're alive. Granite Creek, cave number 7, about 40 feet below the surface. Miguel tried to cut through the bicycle cable with his knife, but the steel was too thick. We need bolt cutters, he said. Morris was already digging through his tool kit, searching for something that might work. Sarah kept holding Lillian's hand, trying to calm her. Lillian, who did this to you? Who brought you here? Lillian closed her eyes. Her entire body began to tremble. When she spoke again, her voice was filled with terror. A man with a mask. A ski mask. A knife. He said, we're his family now. That we have to pray. Pray for forgiveness. Her voice broke. She began to sob softly, pitifully, like a wounded animal. Hannah, still unconscious, let out a faint moan. The rescue operation took 2 hours. Medical teams, cave rescue specialists, and police officers descended into the cave. Using bolt cutters, they severed the cable. Carefully, they placed the sisters onto stretchers. Inch by inch, they carried them through the narrow passages, doing everything they could to avoid causing further injury. At the surface, 2 ambulances were waiting. Deborah Kendrick, who had been notified immediately, arrived about 20 minutes later. When she saw the stretchers emerging from the cave entrance and the emaciated bodies of her daughters, she collapsed to her knees and screamed. It was a raw, primal cry, filled with unbearable pain and overwhelming relief. Even the seasoned rescuers felt their throats tighten. The girls were rushed to St. John's Hospital in Jackson. Doctors went into emergency mode. The diagnoses were devastating. Severe malnutrition, life-threatening dehydration, multiple infections, signs of sexual assault, second-degree burns on various parts of their bodies, broken fingers that had healed improperly, a concussion in Hannah's case, and kidney damage in both sisters. Hannah weighed just 84 pounds at a height of 5 feet 6 inches. Lillian weighed 92 pounds at 5 feet 7 inches. In just 3 weeks, they had lost between 55 and 65 pounds. But they were alive. Against all odds, they had survived. While doctors fought to stabilize their condition, investigators began their work. The cave was sealed off as a crime scene. Forensic teams examined every inch with meticulous care. They found empty food cans, 12 cans of meat, 8 cans of beans, several cans of peaches, plastic water bottles, dirty blankets that appeared to have been used to cover the girls, a battery-powered flashlight, and most importantly, footprints in the damp clay floor of the cave. The prints were clear. Shoe size approximately 11 to 12. The tread pattern was distinctive, consistent with Merrill Moab hiking boots, a model popular with hikers and hunters. Forensic specialists documented and cast the footprints. In addition, several hairs were found that did not belong to the girls. The DNA analysis was sent in for expedited processing. Investigators also recovered a cigarette butt, Marlboro brand. Apparently, the kidnappers sometimes smoked inside the cave. Saliva residue on the filter was sufficient for DNA testing. 3 days later, on August 17th, Lillian was stable enough to give a detailed statement. Detective Margaret Hughes from the Teton County Sheriff's Office sat beside her hospital bed, writing down every word. Lillian said that in the early hours of July 23rd, around 3 a.m., she woke up to the sound of fabric ripping. Someone was cutting into their tent from the outside. Before she could scream or wake Hannah, a man burst inside. He was tall and wore a black ski mask that completely covered his face. In one hand, he held a knife, a long hunting knife. In the other, a handgun. One word, and I'll kill you both right now, he said, Lillian recalled, her voice shaking. Hannah woke up, saw him, and screamed. He struck her on the head with the butt of the gun. She lost consciousness immediately. There was blood, a lot of blood. The man bound their hands with plastic zip ties and stuffed gags into their mouths. He dragged them out of the tent. He carried Hannah over his shoulder. Lillian was forced to walk ahead of him with a knife pressed into her back. They walked through the forest for a long time, maybe an hour, maybe more. Lillian couldn't be sure. She was in shock, barefoot, her feet cut open by sharp stones and branches. Eventually, they reached a vehicle, an old, dark pickup truck possibly a Ford or a Chevrolet. Lillian didn't know car brands well. He threw them onto the back seat and covered them with a tarp. They drove for about 30 minutes, then stopped. He pulled them out and led them through the woods to the entrance of a cave. They descended into darkness, cold, and damp air. Inside the cave, he chained them to a metal pipe using a bicycle cable. He removed their gags. The first thing he said was, "You belong to me now. God sent you to me as a test and as a gift. You will be cleansed. You will pray for forgiveness for your sins." Lillian asked, "What sins? Forgiveness for what?" He slapped her across the face. "No questions. Listen, pray." Then he left them alone in complete darkness. The next 22 days became a living nightmare. He came irregularly, sometimes every other day, sometimes every 3 days. He brought food, canned goods, water. He forced them to eat, saying that God did not want them to die, only to suffer and repent. He forced them to pray out loud, Christian prayers he dictated to them. If they refused or didn't pray loudly enough, he punished them. The punishments were brutal: beatings, cigarette burns on their hands, feet, and stomachs, sexual abuse. First against Lillian, then against both of them. He said it was purification through suffering, that God had commanded him to do this. He was insane, Lillian sobbed. He talked about visions, about God speaking to him. He said we were angels sent to test his faith. Sometimes he was almost gentle. He would stroke their hair, call them his daughters, say he loved them, and an hour later he would beat and burn them again. He was completely mad. Hannah, who regained consciousness on the 3rd day after the rescue, confirmed Lillian's account. She added details Lillian couldn't remember because of the trauma. Hannah said the man had photographed them several times with an old digital camera. She noticed that he had a distinctive accent, Southern, possibly from Texas or Oklahoma. She also saw a tattoo on his right hand, a cross with an inscription she couldn't fully read in the dim light of his lantern. Detectives documented all of this and began narrowing down suspects. They reviewed records of registered religious preachers and anyone connected to churches within a 100-kilometer radius. They searched for individuals with prior legal trouble, conflicts with religious institutions, or signs of religious extremism. That's when one name stood out: Roy Weston, 46 years old, a former Baptist preacher from Pinedale, about 60 kilometers from the abduction site. Weston had been dismissed from his position in 2002 for radical practices and inappropriate behavior. The church refused to disclose specific details, citing privacy concerns. However, former congregants reported that Weston preached extremely conservative, almost medieval, views on sin, punishment, and redemption through physical suffering. After his dismissal, Weston moved into a remote cabin in the woods near Teton National Forest. He lived alone and supported himself with odd jobs, sometimes as a hunting guide, sometimes as day labor. He had no neighbors. The nearest house was more than 7 miles away. Investigators checked his records. Shoe size, 11. Vehicle, an old blue 1996 Ford F-150. He purchased Marlboro cigarettes, confirmed by receipts from a local store. He had a tattoo on his right arm, a cross with the inscription, "Redeemed by Blood." On August 18th, a special operations team surrounded Weston's cabin. The operation began at dawn. FBI agents, sheriff's deputies, SWAT, more than 20 armed officers. They were prepared for armed resistance. But when they entered the cabin, Weston was gone. The cabin was empty, but inside they found evidence. A journal, a thick notebook filled with uneven handwriting, page after page of disjointed religious ramblings, Bible quotes, descriptions of visions from God, and beneath them, entries about 2 angels. July 23rd. The Lord has sent me a sign. 2 young souls in need of redemption. I took them. They resisted, but the flesh always resists until the spirit submits. I brought them to the cave of purification as the Lord commanded. July 25th. They cry and beg for release. They do not understand that I am saving them. I punish them as the Lord punishes sinners. Through pain comes enlightenment. July 30th. The older angel is beginning to understand. She prays with me. The younger one is still stubborn. More work will be required. The entries continued up to August 14th, the day the girls were rescued. Final entry. I hear voices in the forest. They are searching. The Lord is testing my faith. I must disappear for a time. The angels will remain in the cave. If the Lord wills that they be found, so it shall be. If not, they will die, and their souls will ascend to him. They also found a camera. The memory card contained photographs of Hannah and Lillian inside the cave. horrific images of beaten, chained, crying girls. Weston had documented them as proof of his mission. They found a map with the cave's location marked. They found Merrill Moab boots that perfectly matched the footprints discovered in the cave. They found the girl's clothing, t-shirts he had kept as trophies. But Weston himself was gone. A nationwide manhunt was launched. His photo appeared on wanted posters, across television networks, and online. The FBI listed him as one of the most dangerous fugitives. A $100,000 reward was offered for information. For days past, detectives followed every lead, every tip. Weston was reportedly seen in Idaho, false alarm. Spotted in Montana, mistaken identity. Colorado, again not him. Then, at dawn on August 22nd, a hunter named Paul Jackson discovered Weston's blue Ford F-150 parked on a remote forest road about 18 miles from the cabin. The engine was cold. The truck had clearly been there for several days. Inside were Weston's personal belongings, a sleeping bag, and food supplies. Search teams combed the area. About half a mile from the truck, at the base of a rocky cliff, they found a body. Roy Weston was dead. He had fallen from a height of approximately 65 feet. His neck was broken. Multiple bones were fractured. Beside the body lay a hunting knife and a handwritten note on a scrap of paper. "Forgive me, Lord, for I could not complete your mission. I come to you. Suicide or accident?" The medical examiner could not make a definitive determination. Perhaps Weston had jumped, unable to withstand the pressure of the manhunt and the weight of his crimes. Perhaps he slipped in the darkness and fell. Either way, he was dead, and he would never hurt anyone again. For Hannah and Lillian, the news was bittersweet. On one hand, it was a relief. The monster who had tortured them was no longer a threat. There would be no trial, no courtroom where they would have to relive their suffering again and again. On the other hand, it was a disappointment. He had escaped justice. He would never truly be punished for what he had done. "I wanted to see him in prison," Lillian said in an interview a year after their rescue. "I wanted him to spend the rest of his life in a cage, just like the one he kept us in. Maybe this way it's better," she later said. "He's dead. I can move on, knowing he will never come back." Recovery was long and painful. The sisters spent 6 weeks in the hospital. They slowly gained weight. Their infections were treated, and their external wounds healed. Hannah's broken fingers were properly reset and placed in casts. Lillian's kidneys recovered after intensive treatment, but the psychological wounds ran much deeper. Both sisters suffered from severe post-traumatic stress disorder, nightmares, panic attacks, fear of darkness, fear of confined spaces, and deep mistrust of strangers. Lillian couldn't stay in a room with a closed door without panicking. Hannah flinched at every loud sound. Years of therapy helped. By 2012, for years after the abduction, both women had returned to something close to a normal life. Lillian completed her studies, earned a degree in social work, and began working with trauma survivors. Hannah enrolled in college, studied psychology, and planned a career as a psychotherapist. Together, they wrote a book titled 22 Days, Our Story of Survival, which became a national bestseller. They began speaking at conferences, sharing their story, and helping other victims find the strength to go on. "What happened to us was horrific," Hannah said during one of their talks. "But it does not define us. We are not victims. We are survivors. And if our story helps even one person, gives them hope, shows them that you can survive hell and still find meaning in life, then it wasn't all for nothing." The cave where they had been held was officially closed by authorities. Its entrance was sealed with concrete. A small memorial was erected above the site, 2 white stone slabs bearing the names Hannah and Lillian Kendrick and the words, "In memory of the strength of sisterly love and the unbroken human spirit." Their mother, Deborah Kendrick, founded a support fund for families of missing persons, named after her late husband, Marcus Kendrick. The foundation finances search efforts, provides psychological support to families coping with disappearance, and advocates for improved missing person search systems. The story of the Kendrick sisters became one of the most well-known abduction and survival cases in early 21st century America. It showed that even in the darkest circumstances, when all hope seems lost, miracles can happen, that the human spirit can endure the unimaginable, that sisterly love can be stronger than fear, hunger, and pain. Lillian and Hannah Kendrick survived 22 days in an underground prison. They lost weight, health, and part of their innocence. But they did not lose themselves. They did not lose each other. Today, they live full lives, help others, and carry a message of hope and resilience. Their story reminds us that evil exists, but so does good. That monsters are real, but so are heroes. And that sometimes, against all odds, the lost really do find their way home.